The champion golfer, Carl Schimenti. Welcome, Carl, to ATC Office Hours.
Thank you, Micah. Yeah, generous to call me an accomplished golfer. I think I'm just a golfer who spends a lot of time at a golf course and by osmosis maybe finds a trophy or two hidden hidden somewhere. But yeah, cool to be joining you today. I can't wait to chat about the playability.
Yeah, I'm really interested to talk about this, and we have been going back and forth for a while. But we wanted to do this back in February, and it was actually I wanted to schedule something during the week of the golf industry show, and you reminded me that that might not be a good time. And I thought, that actually is not polite to schedule something right during the golf industry show. I said, let's postpone it. And so that would have been in February sometime. And then I went on a round the world trip and then some. And then you've been doing those awesome Cornell Turf Talks, the fastest 30 minutes in turf, which I binge watched. And so, you had all that going on, and now that kind of came to a close. I've been at home for a little while, and then I thought, let's bring back that conversation and talk about playability, because in the Northern Hemisphere, even though there's been two major championships by this time, which is a bit of a shock, it does seem like it's still the start of the golfing season.
Yeah, absolutely. And for us, so for those who don't know, I'm based in New York, up here in Ithaca, and we had a really rough winter damage season this winter, and it really took a lot of golf courses really until mid-May to start recovering in earnest. So just locally, it feels like the golf season is just now starting. A lot of these courses are recovering fully and getting 100%, just barely 100% turf cover now. So you're right. It's really weird to have two major championships before the month of June for us, because we're just starting to get our clubs out of the garages and warmed up. But yeah, it's a perfect time now to talk playability, because we're starting to get into the kind of that 90 days Memorial Day to Labor Day, at least for us up here in the northern U.S.
Now, this this is a live stream, and it's also going to be recorded for later viewing. If you are watching the live stream and want to chat with us or leave some questions or comments, you can go ahead and do that, and we'll respond to those as we have a chance. Now, Carl, your Twitter profile says used to be a professional golfer, now you've got a real job. So anybody that used to be a professional golfer has quite a bit of skill at golf. And now, what is your real job? Could you tell me a little bit about that? Because I'm so interested to hear and to learn from you about what a good playing surface is, what a bad playing surface is, and how we might manage those a little bit more efficiently.
Yeah. So as my Twitter profile says, I play professional golf for basically just 2 years, and there's lots of levels of professional golf, right? And sometimes when you say professional golf, people think Tiger Woods, the people on TV. There are many levels below those rungs on the PGA Tour. There's the Korn Ferry Tour. There's the subsidiaries like the PGA Tour Canada, and then there's mini tours, and that's where I was on the quote unquote mini tours, and so spent a little bit of time kind of just around those, and when you spend some time around some real high level golfers just on that lower level, you realize the gulf in talent between someone like me and even someone who can't even make the PGA Tour Canada. So yeah, I figured out pretty quickly, okay, yeah, professional golf, probably not going to do it for me. And so I had worked for Frank Rossi up here at Cornell as an undergrad, actually just mowing the research plots, doing daily maintenance. And that was a way for me to work early in the mornings during my summers in college, and then get out in the golf course in the afternoon. But when I moved back to Ithaca after playing professional golf, Frank he reached out, he wanted to leverage my environmental engineering degree. So I had a lot of experience kind of looking at data and models and equations. And he said, hey, I think we can leverage that for the turf grass industry. How about you come on? And I worked with the state park golf courses, our New York State Park golf courses. We've had this project continuing with them really since the early 2000s when Frank and Jennifer Grant started this project. But basically, looking at their pesticide use, their fertilizer use, and trying to find ways how we can reduce inputs while maintaining the quality of those golf courses across the state. So I moved into a position really working closely with a lot of the state park superintendents and trying to measure that. So how do we measure pesticide use? Pesticide risk is different from pesticide use. There's models to do that. And then surveying the golf courses and saying, okay, if we use less, are we still seeing conditions that are acceptable for golfers? And that's really where the data started to come in. We built these models. I have a huge Excel spreadsheet that can rate the infrastructure 0 to 100 on a golf course. That's everything from the maintenance facility to the drainage to the irrigation. I can rate an equipment fleet from 0 to 100. You know, how many mowers do you have? Utility vehicles, everything down to the cup cutters. And then we can rate your golf course 0 to 100. How nice are the greens? How nice are the fairways? And we could try and figure out, okay, if you want to get to, for example, an 80 at your golf course, is the infrastructure appropriate to get there? Is your labor force appropriate to get there? And using that data has been really cool with state park decision makers, right? So there's superintendents of the golf courses, and then there's a lot of people above them. And being able to have that sort of data to say, look, you know, the irrigation system is failing, the soils are very poor, your drainage is poor. It would take an enormous amount of inputs to get to the quality you'd like to get to, unless you restore that infrastructure. So I've used the data part of my training in college to work with turfgrass managers to assess where they currently are. Okay, what's going on now, and identify where do you need to improve, whether it's infrastructure, labor, or changes in management practices, which we'll talk about today, to get to your goal. And I think that's going to be the conversation today: is what is a goal? How do you establish a goal for golf course playability?
Yeah, yeah, it's be, exactly. It's a big subject with difficult to come up with a very clear answer because there's
Mhm.
different opinions about what good playability is. There are different ways to achieve that. Even if we did agree about what good playability is, there's a lot of different ways to achieve it. And then when it comes to assessing it, there's a lot of different ways that you can measure these type of things. And that becomes a very broad subject that which is why I think this is going to be a bit of a meandering conversation. And I think we've had one or two other calls privately. And my whole idea with this office hours podcast is to have conversations that I would have anyway. That they're the type of conversations of either somebody wants to talk with me or I want to talk with them. So we have these office hours to discuss them. But when I think the subject would be of general interest, I said, let's record it and let's make it a live stream because I expect that there may be some people out there in the world who would be interested in hearing what we talked about.
Mhm.
So,
So,
yeah,
Mike, I have a
shoot.
question, and maybe it's a good starting point. You know, I talked about what is the goal for your golf course, and and I don't know if you want to focus on putting greens, maybe, and maybe that'll kind of narrow the conversation in today. But what percentage of the golf courses would you say that you work with have a defined goal for their putting surfaces, for example?
Um, 10%, uh, something like that.
Hmm.
It's rare.
Yeah,
And
and it's interesting because there's so many ways, and maybe this is a good segue. Like, what is the most important thing about a putting green? Is it the speed? Is it the smoothness? Is it the firmness? There's all of those things matter. It's really hard to develop a defined goal for your putting greens, and it depends on your clientele, of course. But okay, what is my goal for speed? And that's different on a Monday through Friday than maybe a Saturday and Sunday. Would you start at speed, Micah? If you were going to say, okay, what's the most important thing? Would you say it's green speed?
the most important thing for me is 100% grass cover, which is not
Okay.
related to playability, but generally, when I assess a putting green, I think it's really difficult to get consistent speed. And now I'm talking about a property. We're talking about uh, the 9 holes or 11 holes or 13 holes or 18 holes, however big the golf course is. I'm looking for 100% grass cover on those surfaces because I think it's really hard to get the firmness, smoothness, and speed that we want if we don't have 100% grass cover. So that's kind of beside the point of what we're talking about. But first, I look at that, and then yes, I would look at speed, and that was what I looked at exclusively. I'm always a bit late to the party. People might think of me as being really into data and numbers and stuff, but I'm actually into doing the important work and not doing work that I don't think is important. So because of that, it's a lot of this like benchmarking stuff. It's really hard for me to think like let's just collect data just to have it, which is why I've had this discussion about tissue testing with Doug Soldot. He says you might be able to make use of it sometime, and I'm very resistant to that because I think it takes time and money to do it. It might be misleading if we're not making good decisions with our tissue data. So just to archive it, I don't think that's the job of turfgrass managers. I've always been resistant to that with things like the bobble test, which I was aware of. I've been aware of that for a long time, since 13 years or something. Maybe maybe a little bit longer. Let's say 15 years. Never did it. Always was aware that other people did it, and I'm like, you know what? I'm really comfortable with the stimp meter because I think when you roll the ball to measure the green speed, you don't I thought you don't need to put a number to it of how the ball's snaking, how the ball's bobbling. And I just thought you'd notice if there's deviations or not, and then you would address them. But what I began to notice in 2018, 2019, 2020 is there were a lot of places I was measuring in Thailand, for the most part in Thailand. The green speeds were considered relatively fast by Thailand standards, which would be 10 or above.
Yeah.
And on the bobble test, I would be giving fives or sixes. The ball's just chattering all over the place, snaking a bit. Talking to golf professionals who would say, yeah, the greens are rolling pretty good, but they're not as good as they used to be. And the pros couldn't describe to me what the imperfections were, but they just said there's something not right with the roll. And I was looking at it going, yeah, the superintendents, and not generalizing too much, but at a couple of courses, they were so focused on speed that I had assumed that they would be watching how the ball rolls, and it turned out they weren't. Or if they were, they didn't realize that there was a problem, and they were checking the box that yes, we've achieved the green speed that we're looking for, and they were moving on to other tasks. And that's when I decided about 3 years ago that I was going to start making a point of measuring the bobble test on pretty much every time I do the stimp meter, because I had incorrectly assumed that turfgrass managers were assessing this, and then I realized that at least in some parts of the world they were not.
Yeah, I agree, Mike. And it's one of those things I think, and the Bible test is so interesting. And for those, most of your audience probably knows the Bible test by now, but if they don't, essentially you can just use the roll when you roll it off a stimp meter. But you're essentially looking for the number of times the ball is maybe bobbling, coming off the ground. If it's chattering, not coming off the ground, but maybe oscillating while it's rolling, or snaking left to right, and you're assessing it on a 1 to 10 scale, 10 being perfect roll, no imperfections whatsoever, 1 being basically a aerated green, so to speak. And I think you're exactly right. I think a lot of people think that stimp meter is an a proxy for smoothness, and that, okay, fast greens must be smoother, right? And I think I found the same thing as you, Mike, over time. Now that I've taken a bunch of bobble data and stimp meter data, fast greens can be bumpy. Fast greens can be perfect. Slow greens can be bumpy. Slow greens can be, or smooth, I should say, not perfect, but smooth and true. And it's really interesting because it's really kind of a qualitative measurement when you're rolling in and rating 1 through 10. There is a scoring system, but there's probably some variability between me and you measuring it. But just putting a number to that smoothness and trueness starts making you think, oh, okay, I saw some weird snaking today, and maybe I didn't roll the greens and I hand mowed them, and I'm seeing some snaking on the mow patterns. I've seen that personally on triplexes, where you get some snaking with the mow pattern, but it could be rolling at a 10 or an 11. So I think it's something that definitely should be measured. And in my opinion, the bobble, I think you like it, Mike, because it's really quick, right? You can do it while you're taking your step meter reading, and it's no extra time essentially. There's other ways to measure bobble tests that are uh, more quantitative. They require other pieces of equipment. They take longer. And in my experience, I've found that they mirror what the bobble test marker
Yes.
measures do.
Doug Lind has that excellent article from, I believe, from a recent International Turfgrass Society conference journal, where he compared the bobble test and he measured tests of dispersion, and
Mhm.
he used the greens tester, which is basically you roll balls on a ramp, and you measure how many out of 10 go in the hole. And that is something that I was quite keen about 8 years ago. And anyway, it turned out that from Doug's article, he showed very clearly that the most sensitive is the bobble test, and it turns out that that matches exactly what golfers see, which to me that's the whole point. And I think if you're at a facility where you could say that a score of 8 on the bobble test, which would be absolutely no bobble, means the ball never leaves the ground. So it's never going to hit a grain of sand or a ball mark or a ridge or a seed head or anything. It's never going to hit anything that leaves the ground. The maximum score you can get if it leaves the ground is a 6. And then you would definitely have most of the roll. If you're getting an 8, most of the roll would be perfect, and you would have a a couple of little chatter events, possibly, and that's where the ball just does a little bit of vertical deviation, but it continues going exactly on the line that you expect, and it may do a little bit of subtle snaking, especially as it slows down at the end of the roll. That's an 8. That's an 8 for me. And I I I think it's just so useful to measure that, and that's what golfers see. And if golfers, then the problem is if you just set it up to roll balls into the hole, if you've got freshly core aerated greens, and whether you've filled those holes with sand or whether you haven't filled the holes with sand, all the bounces left and right even out. And so the problem is you end up making just as many putts as you would on a perfect green. But golfers will complain quite a bit, and that the greens have a problem, that the ball's not rolling well. And that's why I think the bobble test is just so elegant in that way.
Yeah,
And you've
you're
used the
absolutely
pair,
right. You're
and
absolutely right. It's the feedback that golfers are basing their opinions on, right? And I think you make a good distinction between uh, golfers looking at the ball as it rolls, and if they're noticing the bobble or the snaking, that's bad, versus golfers who don't make the putt and blame the green because they it breaks one way and they thought it broke the other way and they don't make it. And that's the cool thing about the bobble, is that it measures only what um, is what I would call rational feedback, which is the ball rolling true? And it disregards whether the ball goes in or not, because that is completely dependent on how much force you hit the putt with and how you read the putt.
I've told this story. I don't know if I've told this story publicly or recorded, but when I gave up on the greens tester as a useful tool, it was on some zoysia greens in the Philippines, and zoysia has relatively stiff leaves, So unless you do some pretty intensive maintenance, the ball tends to chatter and bobble and snake. And you've driven carts across Zoysia fairways with lines burned in, haven't you? Have you
I
ever?
have never been on a Zoysia fairway.
Okay. Well, you do that and just take your hands off the steering wheel and you'll know what I'm talking about. I'm sure some of the
Okay.
people watching or listening because as you hit the different stripes, the cart tires just get jerked to the right and then you hit the next stripe, jerk to the left. And so that's in the fairway. And on greens you won't have it quite like that, but there is that stiffness in the leaf blades that will make the ball just move around. So to get a really nice roll on Zoysia greens, you have to do some pretty intensive maintenance, and then you can get nice roll. Well, this was not on a green that was in play. This was on a Zoysia nursery green. So you can imagine it wasn't intensively maintained. I brought my greens tester and I just wanted to shoot videos of how the ball was rolling and how this greens tester was such a cool tool for assessing how the ball would go into the hole and everything. Well, I got going doing that and I couldn't miss. They were all going in. And yet my video and my eyes, the ball was bouncing left, right, left, ding, and then the next one and it's just it was chattering all over the place, snaking all over the place, and we were making like 8 9 in a row. And I'm like, these green that it was obviously an awful roll, and yet though that particular test was not identifying the same thing that my eyes were seeing. And then I thought, this is this is not it. In theory that's perfect because it's like the objective of golf is to get the ball in the hole. So at first I thought, well, as long as you're getting the ball in the hole, this test is telling you that. What more do you want? End of story. And now I realize that that's not what golfers see. That's not what I see. And I don't like putting on greens where I think that the ball is going to bounce left or right or up.
Yeah, I agree. And I've saw just personally when I used to practice a bunch putting, you may have noticed people use chalk lines or string lines. They'll set up in one spot, maybe 5 or 10 feet from the golf hole, and they'll just hit 50 putts, 100 putts from the same exact spot. And what you'll notice, and I think actually some research at Virginia Tech showed this, is once you roll a ball once or twice, it really does kind of make a little depression in even though putting greens are cut at a really low height, it makes a little depression. They call it the legacy effect. And as soon as you roll 5 or 10 putts in, when I'm doing that practice, you almost can't miss. You can cut the putt a little bit, and it'll kind of find that track and go in, and you can draw it. It'll find that track and go in. And I think the same thing is true with that with the greens tester method, the hole out test, I think it's called. Once you find a way to make the putt, you can just kind of roll balls, and most of them will find that little track eventually and go in. And I think for that reason, it's an interesting way to think about is the outcome the same of every putt? Like ideally, that is what we'd like to have, is that a putter from, a golfer from 20 feet away from the hole hits the ball with this amount of force in this direction and it always goes in, or it always misses in the same spot, because we want our greens to be consistent that way. But the reality is measuring that is confounded by that legacy effect. And I think therefore is not a good way to measure the smoothness and trueness of the greens.
Okay. So I like the bobble test. You say that you like the bobble test. Have you used the perimeter, which is an iPhone device, and that's got a ball rolling across the surface, moving an iPhone, and that sure seems like a nice use of technology, but it's one that I now have one that I have access to. I
Mm-hmm.
haven't personally used it, but maybe I'm going to be getting some data from it. And I know you've used it. How does that compare to the bobble test?
It's so the bobble test is one number, right? And that incorporates the left to right, the snaking, and the up and down, the chattering and the bobble. What the perimeter does, like you said, it's an iPhone on basically on a, like, almost looks like a toy cart, and you roll it across the green and use the accelerometers, and it measures the up and down component. They call it vertical deviation. and the left to right component, the what they call lateral deviation. And this was actually the first way I ever measured trueness or smoothness on a golf green. It wasn't the bobble test. It wasn't the hole out test. It was the perimeter. And I'm an engineer. I like the numbers, and I'd rather let a machine measure it so that I can remove my any subjective underlying bias I have. If I want the course to be nice, and maybe I'll rate it differently. So, let me just use this thing. It'll spit out a number, and that way it's completely out of my hands. Um, the thing with the perimeter is, so it gives you those two numbers. It gives you vertical and lateral deviation. You have to roll it, I would say maybe 30 to 50 feet across a green at a certain speed, and you have to walk at a certain speed. You want to try and avoid going on side slopes because that will shift the lateral component and it will make it higher than it actually is. So you need a good run. You need about 30 seconds to take the measurement, just one run of it. And then they suggest that you do it in, I think it's at least 3 directions. So by the time you take the measurement, it takes more than 2 minutes. It takes a good amount of green space to do. So for us researchers on a plot level, it was infeasible because we have, 3 meter by 3 meter plots. So we couldn't do that. But it did spit out good data. It gave us really cool data on the up and down, vertical deviation, lateral deviation. And you'd think, okay, there's greens like you're talking about. Zoysia has a lot of that lateral. Maybe some greens don't have that vertical. Maybe some greens do. But it would be interesting to know, okay,
Yeah.
what greens have maybe lateral, a lot of lateral, but not a lot of vertical. Oh, maybe other greens have a lot of vertical, but not lateral.
Yeah.
In my data, I did not find that. I found a very strong correlation between the vertical deviation and the lateral deviation. But that's on basically bent POA putting surfaces. So I haven't done any warm season grass stuff. But that was the attraction to me is, okay, I have the two components. They call it smoothness is the up and down, and trueness is the left to right. So that was what attracted me to it. It took long, and once I started using the bobble test, in general, it agreed with the perimeter. If I
And
measured a smooth green, it was smooth as according to the perimeter too.
okay. Oh, thank you. That's kind of what I have used the perimeter or seen it used, and I'm aware that it's not quite as simple as doing the bobble test. And I guess for some people they will prefer to measure it more precisely with that. But I'm glad to hear from you. As I'm not sure. So do I call you an accomplished golfer, or it just seems so? You're a you're a plus one, plus two, something like that.
I'm a I'm a plus 3.5 or something
Plus
like
three
that.
and a, oh wow, I'm that's that's very accomplished. So
It's just, but yeah, I think there's a good point, Micah. A lot of people, when I first got into studying turf grass with Frank, he really liked that I was a good golfer. And what I've always tried to tell him and other people is it's not necessarily that I'm good at hitting. A lot of people can be really good at hitting a golf ball into a hole. I think the thing that I value more than my golfing ability is what I'll call golfing IQ, and knowing how a golf course set up, how the ball lies, where the wind is coming from, how all of that affects how the golf ball interacts with the club, how it interacts once it's on the ground, for example, firmness.
mhm,
Um, that's, I think, and people can be bad golfers and have good golfing IQ. And people can be good golfers and they can have bad golfing IQ just because they're really good at whacking a ball.
mhm.
Um, so I think a lot of people give me like a lot of credit that somehow my thoughts on playability mean a lot because I'm a good golfer. I would say it's just because I think I'm good at understanding why a golf ball does what it does. And that's, I think, independent of like, I can hit a fade, 180 to 20 feet or something like that. I think that's immaterial compared to the understanding of how the golf ball reacts in certain situations for me.
Okay. Well, I I like to hear from you as somebody who does have a plus handicap and has played golf to for money, and who now competes as an amateur and sometimes wins championships, you must care about playability of the when you're playing golf, and then when you're doing your day job, which is assessing various things related to golf course maintenance and conditions, that you would say that something as simple as the bobble test is something that you like that number, or you think there's some utility to that. That's to me, that gives it credibility, because I yeah, I want to say that I say so, I assess it this way, so it's fine. But hearing from somebody like you, for whatever reason, it makes me more. It reassures me that I'm not just going down the wrong path.
I'll tell you this much, Mike. I think we've just accepted turf quality as a standard measure in turfgrass literature. I don't see bobble test any different, really. I mean, there's a criteria, there's a rubric for how you score it. There's a rubric for how you score turf quality. I think it's the same exact thing. I don't think we've seen it in the literature, and that will preclude a lot of people in, as you know, in academia, maybe from accepting it as quickly as someone like you or you or me. But I think that if people were to publish and use the bobble test, all of a sudden it becomes something that is accepted at the academia level. But I think superintendents right now, I think a lot of superintendents like the idea of it because it's so simple, and that's the thing about data. And you probably know this better than I do, but what is something that is an impactful measure that you can make decisions, you can use it to make decisions, it's useful to you, and it doesn't take you 2 minutes per green to use and have to buy a piece of equipment. Like the bobble test, you could literally just roll a ball with your hand and get a bobble test measurement, and it's immediately okay. I'm at a 7 today. That's interesting. Last week after my aeration, I was at a 5, and okay, and that's the sort of stuff that Chris Trittabaugh has done, and it's really cool data to see how your golf course ebbs and flows in playability, not just through stim meter readings, but through that bobble test, which golfers value. I've seen survey data. There's one from University of Copenhagen, and there's one from STURF, Scandinavian Turfgrass Foundation. They've asked golfers, okay, how much do you value green speed? How much do you value smoothness? And in both studies, they valued smoothness more than green speed. Certainly there's a regional, maybe a societal component to that, but that's really impactful. Like they value smoothness more than green speed, and we should be measuring that, not just stim meter readings.
Yeah, well, this is fascinating. I'm already getting ideas of things that we can talk about when I have you on another time. Because this one is far from over. I'm not kicking you off. I'm just like, wow, this is this is just fascinating for me, because my background is pretty typical. I think I got a 4-year degree in turfgrass science in horticulture with an emphasis in turfgrass science, and I did internships around the United States on golf courses. I'd actually worked for an entire year before going to university. I graduated from high school a year early and realized I wasn't going to play golf competitively, and I didn't want to go to community college to play golf. So I caddied and did various things, and then I ended up working on a grounds crew, and I just loved it. And then I went to Oregon State for 4 years. So I graduated. I had quite a bit of work experience, and I went to be a golf course superintendent an assistant superintendent in China, and then within 5 or 6 months, I was a superintendent, and in way over my head, and realized it would be good to go back to grad school and learn even more. And so I've had after grad school, if we add all the education together, it's 9 years of university study, and a lot of GCSA seminars and regional seminars and talking with superintendents and so on. Let's say that's from my career. The first 12 years I was in the industry, from 1994 until 2006. And back then for me, a lot of it, if I look back on it now, a lot of the stuff that I was learning and the stuff that I was doing was about growing grass. It was agriculture based, and it wasn't so much about playability. And it drives me nuts now sometimes talking with some of my peers who are still in the university environment to hear them so focused on things that are to me related to agricultural aspects of turf and maybe how to make your lawn grow a lot or something like that, and it's not so much related to what I think golf course superintendents should be doing on a day-to-day basis, which obviously they have the skills to grow the grass, and everybody always says growing the grass is the easy part, and then what they have to do is manage the people and the resources and everything. But I think playability sometimes gets forgotten because we don't learn it in school, and the industry as a whole has not really focused on it so much. So it's only when you get these exceptional superintendents who they don't go around tooting their own horn so much, and sharing with everybody all the tricks and what they're actually focused on. But when they when they're focused on playability, and I think that is what the focus should be. And I wish that there were more classes like that, more seminars about that, and less of this crap about applying balanced fertilizer and stuff that is just guaranteed to increase weeds and guaranteed to increase poa annua and all of these things. It's been frustrating. Well, it's not frustrating. It's fun. It's fun to have these arguments with people, but if you see where the industry is at in 2022, it's a bit sad that we can't just focus on playability. And there's still people that graduate from university. They've done internships. They've got a 4-year degree, and instead of the focus being playability, the focus is like, how can we do the most cultivation work to these greens? How can we close the course for at least one day a week? Maybe get some additional closures. Let's close this property for golf so that we can do things to make the grass grow more. And it's just bewildering for me now, as I've gotten older, as I've seen how it's done around the world, and I see places that never close, rarely close, never cultivate, still produce great surfaces, and you're like, what's going on with some of the places that are not focused on playability?
You make a great point. I think, and a lot of the teaching, and I get why, it's about here's all the tools at your disposal, and here's how you use all these tools. And you go on internships and you learn how to use all the cultivation practices and the different machines, and you can do hollow tine, solid tine, spacings, and time. And I think there's always an indirect assumption. There's an implication that this is going to get you better greens or better fairways or whatever. But very rarely, like you're saying, are you actually doing those measurements? And I guess the metaphor I would make, if we keep it in golf, it would be like if I took golf lessons and I was at the range and they were working on my swing, and I go out and play golf, and I wouldn't keep score. I would just go out and play golf, and then I'd come back to the pro who's giving me lessons, and I'd say, my swing didn't feel like this. Can you tell me what else can I do with my grip that would get the ball to do this? But not even keeping track of my score. Did I score well? Did I score poorly? And then I just go out again, and it would be like, okay, I play golf, and I felt like I hit this one shot bad, and I don't know what I shot, but I don't like that shot. Let me go back and talk to the pro about how I can avoid hitting that shot. I think it all comes back to you have to define what your goals are. And you mentioned lawn turf, like you spend a lot of time. Okay, here's how you grow a good lawn. What's your goal for a lawn? And I work in urban a lot with urban green spaces now, and talking to homeowners. Is your goal 100% turf grass cut at 1.5 inches so that you can play soccer on it, or is it just to have turf cover and to not have to spend a lot of time on it? Like, the goal matters. That's the thing that you should base everything around, is what is your goal? And I think you're right. I think a lot of people do everything with the intent that I'm going to get good playing conditions down the road. And that's why they close the golf course. They do the aerification spring and fall around here. Early in the spring, people are hollow tining and dumping sand on it. Late in the fall, they hollow tine and they dump sand on it. And I get that the schedule of a golf course constrains them to have only a certain week here or there to do that. And that's a problem in and of itself. But that's like the programmatic approach to greenkeeping, right? There's a program, and I've got to do this. I've got to do my foliar applications. I hear all that. My soil application of fertilizer. I still don't really know what that means. Um,
Yeah, if anybody is watching this live or in the future, feel free to drop something in the chat or shoot me an email and tell me what a soil spray is, because I'm still trying to figure that out.
maybe it never. I don't know. Some maybe don't get to the soil. So I agree with you 100%, Mike. I think we spend too much time on all the tools at our disposal and all these things you need to do, and it's ironic because it's a long-term approach that in the long term this is good, and I think the idea is if I cultivate now I don't have to do it later, but that never really comes to fruition if you just keep doing it every spring and fall.
Yeah,
And there's
and
certainly you need to
I'm
do it. Like I think we need to be maybe what you're saying, and it's a good thing. Should we be more short-term focused? How can I not close the next 2 Mondays and have good greens conditions? Is that possible? And is that not going to mortgage my playing conditions later in the year? I don't know.
Yeah, it's clearly site specific and club specific, and there's a lot of places out there that don't close and they get great results, and there's other places that do close and it's essential and they're getting great results too. And I know what my personal preferences might be as a golf player. I like to play on surfaces that are really good, no matter when in the year I go. But that's a personal preference, and I think some people don't. They're not so picky about it, apparently. But I think I also have the luxury of being in a job where I can change my mind when I learn new things or realize that I was wrong before. And you may have heard one of my talks or read on my blog where I was speaking in Ireland in March, and I used one of my slides from 2014, which is fairly recent, just to say I used to recommend all this stuff in terms of core removal, surface disruption, and the amount of sand that's applied. And I don't recommend that anymore. And now I used to recommend that everywhere in the world as a general approach. And now I recommend being much more site specific. And that was something that I've completely changed since 2014. And it's fun for me to be able to correct myself and say, look, I used to recommend this. Now I just like to do better and better, because you can get great conditions doing that. And there's a lot of places that do, but I think you can get even better. You might need to do more than that, or you might be able to do less. Why would every single grass, every single soil type, every type of traffic, if you're doing 12,000 rounds versus doing 60,000 rounds, why would you possibly need the same amount of sand?
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite likely that you would not. And well, all of these things are so site specific that I realize that I've just sequentially been developing a series of tools or techniques that I think can be really useful in being able to optimize conditions in a site specific way, which is things like MLSN for nutrients, things like growth potential for site specific nitrogen ideas, things like clipping volume. Jason Haynes mentioned that when you were talking about things that people won't do in academia because it's not been published. And you're like, Jason says literature also needs to include growth rates. So things like clipping volume, it's that's very site specific. And then things like OM246 and other things that you can do to measure things in a really site specific way. That's what I recommend now. And I I don't know if you saw the conversation I had with Andrew McDaniel last week where,
I
okay,
got you on my list.
so it's a good one. So I'll describe to you why I was so excited to talk with him about that. because you might have seen last year, and I'm gonna pull up. Um, I'm gonna pull this up and just show the tab of something. This I'm showing on the screen now, the ATC website with the playability tag. And last year I did a video that I'm not gonna play here, but the video is in a post that is titled "What Happens When You Play Golf on Greens That Were Top Dressed Only Once in a Year," and I showed ball reaction ball reaction of bounce and roll on Zoysia greens at the Sansang KBC Augusta tournament last year, and that is um, that that is a post that I showed last year. That video is 8 minutes long, and it shows how the ball reacted on those greens during the tournament. And it just so happened to rain 32 inches or 800 and some millimeters in the few weeks right before the tournament. And the greens had only been top dressed once. And that was kind of remarkable. I was worried about what the surfaces would be like, and the ball still bounced and rolled. It was fine. It was a successful tournament. And Andrew's been doing the OM246 testing, total organic matter by depth in the surface, for uh, 6 years now. He started in 2017, so I think we're on the sixth year, 5 growing seasons, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Yeah, six. I think 6 sampling events, 5 growing seasons. Andrew took samples in February of 2022, after last year when he had only top dressed the greens one time last year. And we talked about this in last week's office hours. And the organic matter did not change. And that's what's shocking to me, because in 2014, when I was making those recommendations of everybody should be disrupting the surface a lot and putting a lot of sand down, I was expecting that if you do nothing, things will get out of control. And I know it's only an anecdote, it's only one location that I'm talking about, but it can't be the only place in the world that where that's possible. It just can't be. And I I think that not only does it tell you that at that facility they're able to achieve that, but if you're not doing enough, if your organic matter is going up year after year after year, and if your surfaces are getting softer and softer year after year, you, by doing that type of testing, you also will be able to identify that. So now I'm kind of talking about firmness of the greens. And I think that so much of the sand that goes down and so much of the holes that get punched, whether that's sand injection with a dry eject, whether it's solid tines and putting sand in those holes, whether it's core removal and putting sand in those holes, all of those practices seem to be for the purpose of getting more sand in the green, and the whole dilution is the solution or
To
whatever,
pollute or something like that.
something like that, which is something that I used to say, and I don't say it so much anymore, because as I've started measuring it and looking at it, it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Actually, when you punch holes, it makes the surfaces softer, which I wasn't quite realizing, but at least temporarily it makes them softer. And um, and I'm just and everybody that puts sand down, they typically are maintaining a faster growth rate than you would if you didn't put the sand down. So you just keep creating more organic matter. And that's where maybe we can transition to talk a little bit about firmness, and and how that can be assessed, because that one you might need a special tool or maybe you don't.
Yeah, it's so you make a couple really good points, Micah. The first one, greens that are consistently sand top dressed or even USGA spec greens. So and maybe this is where my playing ability comes in. Um, those can play firm. They can also play soft. But the way the ball reacts on those surfaces, I've noticed, is much different than maybe a native soil green that doesn't get top dressed very often. And this is such a golf nerdy thing, but when I look at firmness, okay, where did the ball land and where did it finish? That's kind of the baseline. Okay, how much did it hit here and it ended up here? Okay, 20 feet it released. But sometimes when I'm playing golf, I'll notice, okay, on native greens, it hits and it pops way up in the air. And then it comes down and it spins a little bit or something and stops at 20 feet. A sand-based green, it might hit and it might thud, and it doesn't take a big bounce. It takes a small bounce, but then it kind of dribbles out, and maybe it's still at 20 feet. And those to me are two different ways to get to firmness, but they're things I've noticed anecdotally. I don't have a way to measure that yet. I really want to measure some of those dynamics if you have a sand-based root zone, and how the spin and the force is taken out of the ball and how that relates to how it releases. But I've certainly noticed that in my experience as a player, native soil versus sand top dressed or sand based greens react differently. Now, how to measure that is the hard part, and we use a pretty cheap, relatively cheap. It's maybe $500 now, but the Field Scout True Firm is one way to go. It's very similar to the USGA True Firm or the Clegg. It's got a kind of a plunger. You release it, it thuds in the ground, and it spits out a number. The USGA True Firm is the same thing. The Clegg also is another way to go. It's got a missile, and you drop it from a specified height. It spits out a number. For a lot of superintendents, I think those can be expensive pieces of equipment. Even $500, the True Scout, that's not cheap. And a lot of the courses that might think about using it, maybe they can purchase that. But the Clegg is starting to get really expensive. USGA True Firm, I don't think you can purchase. But I like, if you don't want to purchase anything, maybe I'll call it the Dan Donnelly method. Have you seen these videos, Micah, where Dan is or maybe his assistant superintendent is just chucking balls at the ground and seeing how high they come up?
I
I
saw
kind
the
of like.
one where they did the compost top dressed fairway versus the sand top dressed fairway.
Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. That video is, the link is floating around somewhere, but it's a really cool video. And Dan is talking about exactly what I'm describing on a compost, more native soil side of the fairway. His assistant superintendent is throwing the ball down and it's bouncing up to maybe his knee or his hip. And then they go over to the other half of the fairway, that's sand top dressed. He's throwing it and it's thudding, and it's not even coming up to his halfway through his calf. And it's very striking, and you can really visually see the difference between how those two are reacting. And I think that's just as good of a proxy as something like a True Firm. It starts to get tougher if you're really trying to manage, plus or minus 5 or 10% firmness. Maybe that's
Okay.
probably not a super accurate way to do that. But it's
Here's
an interesting video for sure.
it's a very interesting video. I shared it on Twitter last week or the week before, I think. I'll put it. I'm not going to try to bring it up right now because I'm not really accustomed to sharing lots of other things, and I'm afraid that I'll mess up our conversation right now. But I made a note to put a link to that in the description of this video when I record it, and in the podcast version of this also about the Donnelly. So I'll try to, what I do. It's hard for me sometimes to find the time to listen to all this stuff that I've recorded, but once it's on YouTube, I can listen to it at double speed, at 2x speed. And because I've already had that conversation, sometimes with other people, I don't want to listen to it quite that fast because I'll miss some things. But with a conversation where I've done it, I can listen to it at 2x speed, and I'll just take some notes of, oh yeah, I said I was going to share that Donnelly video or something. So I'll probably do that and scan through this and try to pull out all the things that we've referred to, like Chris Trittaball's excellent series of blog posts and how he's sharing the playability data and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So Jason, I'm looking at his comment, and so I suggested if you don't want to buy a Field Scout True Firm or a Clegg, I suggested throwing it on the ground, maybe measuring how far it comes up or something. Jason suggested subjective, just 1 to 5. How does it feel underfoot? I like that sort of thing where you can come up with any way to just rate it 0 through 3, 1 through 5, 1 to 10. I kind of like if you just make something up, that's a good way to do it. I would do it in the same shoes every time, Jason, for sure. I'm used to testing a bunch of golf shoes, and we do this work with FootJoy. We test like a bunch of golf shoes every year for how they change the putting greens. But based on the insole, you will feel like you're on a firmer surface or a softer surface. So if you're going to do that, like just use the same shoes every time. Um, Another suggestion would be to look at the ball marks, the pitch marks, because you're going to have unfixed pitch marks on every green. That's just the nature of the beast. I know the U.S. I think it's the PGA Tour uses kind of a caliper. They drop a ball and they measure the depth of the pitch mark that this ball makes. If you could just subjectively look at unfixed pitch marks, are they deep? Are they shallow? Like, so some greens that are firm but that don't have a lot of turf density will have really like skid marks. So they won't be deep, but they'll be kind of long. So that might be an indication of, oh, my turf density isn't quite good enough to repair to handle maybe some traffic. If you get really deep ones that really plunge into the ground, they expose the soil on the back half. That's maybe soft. And then I would say firm is where you're getting to the point where you're seeing ball marks that don't even penetrate into the soil, that are just little depressions that you'd have to really look around for the ball mark. That's starting to indicate really firm, I think, to me. But
That's
so pitch marks is maybe a good way to do it.
that's all very good advice. And here's what I've come around to recommending. Here's what I'm currently recommending. If if you are, for example, a tournament venue and you want to get really precise about how does every single maintenance activity that I do affect the firmness here over time, then I recommend getting the golf course firmness tester from SDI in England, which is the Clegg from England, the yellow one that the R&A used, that STRI used, the one that I have. And I've used the USGA True Firm, the Spectrum Technologies True Firm, that particular Clegg, the PGA Tour ball bearing drop, the
Mm-hmm.
Yamanaka tester in Japan, and by far my favorite, both for usefulness of the readings, predict correlation with what I observe when I play golf or observe professional play, and ease of use is that particular Clegg. And
Okay.
it's called the Golf Course Firmness Tester. I actually have a ATC double cut recorded about that particular topic that will be coming out sometime in June, I think. So that's what I recommend if you're, let's say you're Bethpage Black, and you know that you're going to be hosting the Ryder Cup and future major championships and state level championships. Then if I was wanted to really assess firmness, that's the particular tool that I would want to have. But I think that's overkill for every golf course. And Jason's using a 1 to 5 scale that he mentioned. He said he started assessing firmness on a scale of 1 to 5. And what I would default to for every facility to assess firmness would be a 3 point scale, whether that's A, C, F, or 1, 2, 3, or 0, 1, 2. It's either too soft, just right, or too firm. And that's something that I can assess by what you just described, by watching other people hit balls, by walking across the surface. Well, let's call it a combination of these. By watching other people hit shots and watching the balls react, by looking at the pitch marks that are created, by walking across the surface myself, and by playing golf. I I can assess that. And I think that anybody that's working professionally in this industry should be able to assess it. So for me, Jason's got 2 extra points that for me, that's a little bit harder to assess because I'm not sure that I can assess like it's almost too firm, but not quite. It's
Mhm.
like, I'm just going to say it's not. If it's not too firm. And I've played on courses that are too firm. I played Charleston Municipal was the last round of golf I played in uh, early March, late March, mid
Mhm.
March. I some a long time ago. Uh, I played Charleston Municipal, and it's like 2 year old Tiff Eagle or something. So it's sand based greens, warm season grass. You know how those are. And for a player of my ability, with a light breeze on that day, I could hit a a full 9 iron from the fairway, landed in the center of the green, and it would bounce over and roll off the back. And so I'd land it pin high, and you were like, well, you should land it short. But I'm not skilled enough to land it on, like, and I was playing with borrowed clubs, so my yardages were not perfectly. So I couldn't land the ball where I wanted to land it. But it was unfortunate that I landed it well short of the back of the green, and it would go off the green repeatedly. My assessment of those greens are for the caliber of player that was there. I would say that's too firm. But I rarely play greens that are that firm. But I know it when I when I'm on them.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I like too soft, just right, or firm, especially for the golf courses that like you're saying, if they're not going to buy this the golf course firmness tester, I think that's an excellent way to gauge because you're tailoring toward your members or your daily play if you're public, and that's an excellent way to measure it. I think. When you're talking about when you're watching people play, I think this is something I think about a lot. I don't know if superintendents think about it, but like the golf IQ portion comes in here where when you're watching people play, I think it's important to know distance, lie, wind, and elevation. So if you have holes where the green is elevated, by the nature of the ball flight, the ball is coming in at a shallower angle. So if you choose to watch a hole, if you're kind of want to watch a hole for a couple groups to see what the firmness is like, if you're picking a hole that the green is elevated on, the ball is certainly going to release more on that hole because the ball is coming in at a shallower angle. So that's one elevation, and the inverse is true where if it's a green that's below the level of the player, it's going to be coming in steeper. You're going to see a bigger pitch mark, even if the green is just as firm as another green, and the ball is going to stop quicker. So just having that in mind, having in mind how far the player is from the green. If they're 100 yards, they're going to be able to stop it probably quicker than if they're 160. The lie matters. So even if they're just in the first cut or the rough, that's taking a lot of spin off the golf ball. So just an example from a fairway, the average PGA Tour player hitting a 7 iron will spin the ball about 6,000 RPMs, give or take. If you put them in the rough, that can drop down to 4,000. It can drop down to 3,000, less than half the spin. So again, knowing, okay, where the ball is coming from, that's going to change how it reacts on the green. So just keep that in mind. And then, of course, the wind. So downwind is going to take spin off the ball. It's going to shallow its descent. We call it descent angle. And into the wind is going to increase the descent angle, increase the spin. It's going to stop quicker. So all those things just to keep in mind when you're assessing. And I think this is a good point, Micah. Like, we talk about stimp meter. We're measuring it to the inch. Bobble test, we've got 1 through 10. I think it's okay for firmness. Not getting so nitty gritty in there. Just okay. Is it good? Is it too soft? Is it too firm? I really
Yeah.
like that
And we
characterization.
we might 10 years from now make a different recommendation, but
Right.
right now I'm really comfortable saying that if you want to do it more, if you want more points on the scale, go for it. But for me, if it's too soft, we need to take action so that it's not too soft. If it's too firm, we also want to take action. And if it's just right, then we want to keep doing what we're doing. And
I have
so
a
I think
philosophical question for you, Micah. Can
you've
I
got
ask you a
what kind
philosophical
of
question?
philosophical? Sure.
Yeah. So we're talking about data, and this comes back to your conversation with Doug about tissue testing. You can either start at the simplest version and build your way up to something that you like, or you can and what I've done is start at the most complex level and measure everything, and then kind of filter in what I like and what I think is unuseful. Would you rather start at this very simple base, too soft, just right, too firm? even if you don't have, like, if you don't have a stimp meter, you could do the same thing, right? You could do too fast, too slow, just right. Would you rather start at that kind of simplistic level and then kind of add things as you kind of feel like, oh, I like this piece of data, I'm going to add some stuff?
Yeah,
Or
but
it seems like you like that bottom up
it's
approach, right?
it certainly seems like it. If I would assess the way that I think about managing turf grass, it's and taking measurements and spending time. I I don't want to do something if it's not having an effect, which is why I was making that joke about soil sprays earlier, because it's like, what are you trying to accomplish? And what is that? And people use words like soil conditioner or something. Maybe not so much in the US, but in Europe I hear words like soil conditioner and stuff, and I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. What's a soil conditioner? It's like, is it a fertilizer? Is it a biostimulant? Is it a wetting agent? Like, we could be specific, but when you say the word soil conditioner, I'm like, whoa, what are we trying to accomplish with that? So to go back to your question, definitely, if you're talking to me, probably the way that my brain has tended to be wired, or the way that I tend to respond to things, is building it up from fundamentals and from the simplest thing. So as I find something that works, and then if I decide that it's useful, I'm going to recommend that, but I don't want to do it a complicated way when it could be done easier, because the golf course maintenance work never ends. There's always trees that could be pruned, or bunkers that could be edged, or pond edges that could be beautified, or tee markers that could be, I mean, there's drainage to install. There's an endless amount of work, and I don't like to waste that time doing anything that's not absolutely essential. And that's why I will tend, for whatever reason, I'll tend to try to simplify. And I'll give another example. It's not related to playability, but this week is the 10th anniversary of the introduction of the MLSN guidelines, which is
Okay.
a joint project that ATC, me, did with Larry Stoll and Wendy Galernter from Pace Turf. And in 2012, this week in Philadelphia, Larry made a presentation about MLSN, and that abstract is available on the Pace Turf website. And I think there will be an update this week on the Pace Turf website that will share that and show those original MLSN guidelines. Well, you're familiar, Carl, with the current MLSN guidelines, which are potassium, phosphorus by a single extraction method, Malic 3, calcium, magnesium, sulfur. That's it. Well, you might be interested to know, if you haven't checked that 10-year-old abstract of the original MLSN guidelines, those had 3 different phosphorus numbers, one for Malic 3, one for Bray 2, one for Olson. They had a sodium number for a maximum sodium that you wanted to stay below. They had minimums, I think, for iron, nitrate, and ammonium. There was a lot more to it. And as I looked at it, and then we came up to version 2, there was back and forth between me and Larry, and mostly from my side, I wanted to simplify it and just look at the things that are really essential to it. And that's, so you asked that question, and it reminds me of MLSN and various other things where I will tend to simplify, but if it turns out that manganese is really important, we have all the data, and we will add manganese to MLSN. But until the sodium thing as a maximum instead of a minimum was confusing people. And the nitrate and the ammonium I just didn't think were necessary. And I didn't want to do micronutrients with Malic 3 at that time and have it maybe as a appendix or something. I would be comfortable with it, but not on par with, in the same table with, phosphorus and potassium. And now, yeah, and you might be able to imagine that in my mind I'm thinking about some other things that I might like to drop out of MLSN too. But that's not about playability, but definitely I like to simplify.
Yeah, I think it goes to the I think it respects the superintendent's time too. Like when you suggest something, you want to suggest it that it's going to be impactful and take the least time to get it and get the most value out of it. And that's why I like that approach. And I've like in my work, I take the opposite because I like to have all these stuff, and I can be a person who can look at all the data and sift through. Okay, I don't. I've rated every state park golf course green for their light availability, their air movement, the percentage POA and bent. I've done this for literally like 200 golf greens, and over time, I was like, okay, I measured all the air movement. I have this light rating. I'm just going to use the light rating and distill it down. But for a superintendent, you've got so many other things to do. Start simple and build up. I think that approach is it respects the superintendent's time and the value that they're going to get out of it to start. And then you can add things, right? And I think that's the clipping volume thing. I think forever superintendents know growth rate and how that maybe reacts and how that correlates with playability. But I think that was one thing where it's like, okay, maybe it's worth that extra minute to put it in a bucket and measure it. And I've gotten maybe 6, 7 superintendents to do it in New York, and every time it's impactful, and every time it's like, oh, like wow, I was growing at 5 times the rate in this month than I was this month. Whoa, okay, and like I never would have thought that. And that is impactful. And that is what is cool about taking some of this data. And I think the same would happen for playability data too, is wow, okay, my bobble test went way down. Like that 50% reduction, oh boy, like what happened there?
Yeah, like what I measure myself is pretty intensive, but it's not what I recommend other people do because I'm doing this often for research purposes. So this is one green from uh, this is this is the 18th green at the PGA Catalonia during the recent Catalonia Championship on the DP World Tour. I measured the Clegg 9 times, TDR 9 times. I measured soil temperature at 3 locations, surface temperature at 3 locations. I measured the temperature, the humidity, the heat index, the dew point, and the wind speed. I measured the stimp meter at 3 different locations on the green, together with the bobble test on 3 different locations. And I noted the work that had been done and the exact time of day. And then I went and did that on some other greens also. I don't recommend that people do that, but that's what I do. And I'd like to share with you what I currently recommend that in terms of playability measurements and get your feedback both as somebody who does this for work and as somebody who's interested in golf course maintenance and as somebody who plays golf and I'd like your feedback on this. So what I'm currently recommending for typical golf courses would be once a week through the year, measure the green speed on 3 greens. At the same time you're measuring the green speed, measure the bobble test
Mhm.
and assess the firmness on that 3 point scale. And the first time you do it, it may not, and do that on 3 greens. So I think that'll take maximum 1 hour. So now you've got green speed, you've got bobble test, and you've got firmness. If you're on a if you're year round, as you do that, eventually you're going to have 52 data points. Generally, I recommend Friday as being pretty good because I think it's prepped for the weekend. On weekend, you don't have time. And on Monday or Tuesday, there might be maintenance work or there's a lot of ball marks right after the weekend, and it's not quite ideal. So I would think like Thursday or Friday, go measure that. That's Let's say you spend 1 hour a week, or maybe you have 2 people do it. That's two hours per week, 2 working hours per week. And I think that's really valuable after 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, that you'll start to see how maintenance activities affect your peaks and your lows. And you'll see, and then you can multiply if you're at the standard that you want, you can multiply that by 7, and so you just assume that it was that way all week. Or if you, I mean, basically, you could assess that by weeks. You could say for 52 weeks of the year, we were at or above our minimum playability standard. But you could also say on 8 weeks out of the year, we failed to meet that. And if you want to, multiply that by 7, and now you've got it in days. And to me, that is a really simple way to get started. 1 hour a week, you by measuring at least three greens, you're able to take an average, and that now you've got speed, you've got smoothness and trueness of roll, and you've noted firmness, and then now you can look at what your recovery time is from disruptive practices, and does verticutting and top dressing regularly seem to increase your firmness or not, and so on.
Yeah, I like I for sure I like that. I think the first thing that superintendents are going to do when they do it weekly is they're going to want to do it more. I think at least the superintendents I've worked with, and maybe this is just, and Dave Hicks, Dave Hicks is just recently retired from the Cornell golf course. I can hear him in my head saying, well, if you're going to do just Fridays, why don't you just do it Wednesday and Monday too? Because things can change on a dime. And I do agree with that. The one adjustment, I think if you're somebody who would rather do one green 3 times a week, I don't hate that either. I think if you choose the correct green, that is a proxy green for the rest of the golf course, that would be a good approach too. You can get more time, more data points in the time series, and you might note some more trends on just the time scale of how maintenance practices change how your greens are. But I do like the 3 greens because I think a good categorization for most courses that I've dealt with is you have your indicator greens, right? Your poor greens that show damage first, that are in bad growing environments. You have your best greens that have full sunlight, and then you got just your normal green. And I really do like that because that outlines the variability surface to surface, and sometimes that's just as valuable as knowing the number of your average green. I think I've seen certainly golf courses where there's huge differences in the size of greens and the growing conditions, that you can get stip meter readings that are literally 2 feet different from green to green, and the bobble will be a 6 versus or will be like a 5 versus an 8, and that's a big difference. So if you have a green that's maybe more consistent throughout the property, maybe you could allocate that 3 times a week, one green, if you feel comfortable doing that. But most golf courses, I would say, have that sort of bad, good, average growing environment. And that's why I like the 3 greens for those exact measurements you're talking about. Like, I think it's stimp meter reading. You do the bobble while you're taking the stimp meter. And some measure of firmness, I think, is a really good way to just dip your toe in the water. And the thing I've found is if people can just dip their toe in the water, I think they realize pretty quickly that it's valuable. I would caution people, if they start on that sort of process, don't start reacting really quickly to everything. I would say just measure it and file it away for a month or 2 months, and then be a little bit more retroactive when you analyze it. Don't be so reactive to like, oh, okay, today was 8.5, last week was 9.5. What did I do? Because like clipping volume, the weather can really change the green conditions. We've seen this at our research plots. Like, we can measure at 7 a.m. where there's still some moisture in the top sort of canopy. 2 hours later, the green speeds increased 1.5 foot, and bobble got better. We didn't do anything to the greens; it just evaporated out, and
I
made the greens play better. So that's another thing is
Mhm.
time of day or conditions. So if you just
Yeah.
got hammered with rain, postpone it a day. That makes a big difference too. So that'd be the qualifier, I'd say, is
Yes.
just the time of day consistency, or the type of weather consistency.
Yeah, I think it's the more often it could be done, the better. But at minimum, I think once a week, and not really reacting to it in the short term, but reacting to it very strongly in the medium to long term by saying, wow, we didn't we consistently had a problem with firmness or something, or the and you can start to see the variation from green to green also by measuring multiple greens. And if you do that, you can then start trying to minimize the variability and making things more consistent, which from a playability perspective is pretty important.
And I know the stimpmeter was invented to kind of assess variability across all your greens. But and maybe this is where my player instinct comes in again. Um, Sometimes the feedback from golfers can be that a certain green was slow or fast. I would make sure that if they're singling out one green in particular, just noting the slope on that green, because greens that have more, if you have flat greens on your golf course and then you have two that are really tilted, uphill putts are going to come up short from golfers on those holes because they're not used to that slope, and downhill putts will go past the hole on those holes because there's a lot of slope. So that would be another qualifier I'd make is
I
uh, is the slope on the hole is to gauge golfer feedback and kind of, oh, was it on 10? Okay, 10's got that real false front that you got to watch out for.
Yeah, golfer feedback can be a challenge. I I think we talked about this a couple years ago, about how I I really want to figure out what golfers can tell in terms of differences in green speed, because the amount of research that's been done about that is very limited, and yet it will people seem to take it as a hard and fast rule that professional golfers probably can't tell anything less than a 6 inch difference, but it's not quite clear if it's plus or minus 6 inches, which would be a 1 foot difference, or whether it's plus or minus 3 inches. It's absolutely not clear if that's what people's perception is. And then like average golfers sometimes can't tell plus or minus 6 inches. It's really vague what people think. And it's not, there's been a little bit of research by Dr. Karcher and Dr. Nikolai and maybe Brandon Horvath, at Michigan State. So they've done a little bit of research like that, but and then you look at it, it's like, wait a second. I think some of this was on research plots, and it was with golf course superintendents as the testers, not they. That's who was doing the assessing, not average golfers. And I think they might have done some of this at a professional tournament in maybe at the, is it Franklin Hills where that tournament used to be?
I'm not sure.
I
I'm
can't
aware of the
remember.
one you're talking about, the superintendents, and that was the case, which is
And that
like,
was, yeah. So but and I'm like, now green speeds are faster generally around the world. Green speeds are faster than they were when that work was done. And I want to be a little bit more precise with it and do more complicated statistics. So because the green speed, as you mentioned, it changes. And so I tried this in Bangkok, and I was measuring the green speed through a morning just continuously. So the person who was helping me do the experiment, she was interacting with the golfers and telling them what they were supposed to be putting, where they're supposed to putt to, how they're supposed to rate it. And I was just there constantly measuring green speed for hours. And it varies like crazy, even though we're measuring in the same spot. It was, I expected it just to go down, get slower and slower, but it was actually getting faster for a while. And but I almost completely lost my train of thought, but I remembered because it's to go back to what the golfers think that they're doing. And the golfers, what they were rating was absolutely unrelated to what I was measuring in terms of green speed. And there were some professional golfers there that were rating it, and they were they were wrong more often than they were right. And they really are confused about uphill versus downhill. And I'm talking about green speed, but they're talking about this particular putt seems
yes,
fast or slow to them.
exactly.
And it's in Thailand, and it's like, and we were mostly dealing with Thai golfers or Japanese golfers for the most part. It's like, gosh, we have some huge communication issues. But I realized we can't even, my the we were communicating this in Thai also, and it just wasn't getting across. And I realized probably anywhere in the world, what golfers think of as green speed is so, for them, it must be so related to the slope of the putt that it's really tough to tease out the answer that I was trying to ask a question, but I wasn't getting an answer to the, they were answering a different question than the one I was asking.
Golfers don't speak our language, Micah, and it's fascinating for me to put when I play in competitive events, and I play with good golfers, and there's always they'll make some comments about the greens, whether they're really good or really bad or fast or slow, and it's just so interesting to me because they'll a lot of them try to be like, oh, these are only rolling like an 8, or like, oh, they're only rolling like a 12, and it's like, guys, I've spent so much time taking stimp meter readings. I can't tell you from putting on a green, I can't get within a half a foot of very often of the stimp meter reading. And that's because like usually when I'm measuring stimp meter readings, I'm not also putting on the green, which is kind of interesting. But that's someone who is familiar with stimp meter readings. I'm not going to say if it's a 10 or 11. I don't know, somewhere in there. But these people feel really like, oh yeah, this is like only a 9.5 today. And I'm like, okay, but that you just hit an uphill putt and you left it short. So and they also think that green speeds change from uphill to downhill. So they'll be like, oh, it's running like a 15 downhill. And I'm like, that's not how it works. It's not like it rolls 8 uphill and down 15. Like there's a green speed, and then there's how the slope is affecting the ball.
Yeah, I
And
think
and so much of it is their perception based on how they're playing too.
I
That is
think
such a big component of it.
and I think there's opportunities for people to do really practical research about things that are so important to players like green speed, and just trying to understand that more, which is part of the reason why I measure 3 different locations on a green, because I'm trying to measure both green to green variation, but also within green variation. And I've done that on hundreds of greens now, and here's one of my pet peeves and one of my research projects, and why I have a lot of notebooks full of this data is I go to tournaments sometimes and I see whether it's the tournament agronomist or the rules official, they'll go make a single stimp meter measurement. They will fail to make a Breedy correction on it, and
Mhm.
they'll often measure something that's invalid because there's more than an 18-inch difference between the rolls, more than a if you're using the full length stimp meter. And they won't do something that's gratuitous, but it will often be a little bit long. So it means they're overestimating the green speed by a small amount. And then they'll sometimes, based on one single measurement on a green, make a decision of this green's going to get an extra treatment, bring the roller over here, or they're like skip this treatment. And I I'm I'm trying to do statistics on this to figure out like what the probability is that they're making a correct decision. Like how far from the overall average of all the greens do you need to be before it's valid that you can be confident that your single measurement that you've made on a green is something that you should actually change the maintenance work. And I've been to enough tournaments and seen how, to me, it's just, it's a bit absurd how people take these numbers as fact. Of like, we've measured the stimp meter at one location, so now we're going to change the work on this entire green relative to the other greens on the property. And you people on radios, phone calls, equipment staged to do all of this differential work, that to me I'm just like, I'm afraid there's some misunderstanding of numbers there and statistics. So it's something I don't have an answer for, but I'd like to be able to make a probability of like, what's the probability of people making a correct or incorrect decision in those cases?
That's fascinating because I was at PGA, the PGA at Bethpage in 2019, and so I was the person who would get all the stimp meter readings and kind of just make a little one pager, and it had all the green speeds and standard deviation. And I used, you were referencing that 6-inch work. I did plus or minus 6 inches, so within a foot. So I actually made it a foot range,
Hmm.
um, and I tried to be conservative. So I wasn't I went conservative in the sense that I wanted an outlier to be a real outlier for it to necessitate a different practice. So that's what we did. And honestly, and I gave it to the Mike Hadley, the superintendent, and Andrew Wilson, the director of grounds there. And I think and the really cool thing about the setup guy, Kerry Haig at the PGA, is it sounded like he was just interested in vaguely what they were. And then he would putt around and figure out, okay, so today, whatever the green is today, and you measured it, it was X. I like this because when I want to do a pin location here on Sunday, this green speed is perfect for it. If it's faster than this, I'm not going to be able to use this pin. And so I need it to be whatever this is on Sunday. And regardless of what the number was, that sort of feel is the extra thing in relation to the data that makes it a good setup. So I agree 100%. Like parsing 6 inches here and there, it's really when you start to get outlier greens, I think that you can start making those changes. Not like it's a foot and 2 inches. Oh boy, I don't think that makes a difference for I don't think the pros can tell you, oh yeah, this is 14 inches faster, and clearly this can't be putted on, right? I think it's got to be an outlier for me to be requiring that different
Yeah,
maintenance.
and I think ones that are an outlier, they should be checked at multiple locations and make sure you're just not on a fast spot or a slow spot. Because that same difference that you get from green to green, when you start measuring multiple locations on the same green, you get similar levels of
Within
variation.
the variability,
And so
absolutely.
you're talking about a foot, and that's about in the ballpark. So you could conceivably on a tournament prepared green have one spot that's a valid stimp meter roll that's rolling a foot different than somewhere else. Now it might not be common, but it may not be an outlier either. And then when you start treating that entire green different, saying we're going to single cut this one and no roll because our stimp meter spot just happens to be fast. It's something that concerns me. And I think if you've got, that's where clipping volume can come in really handy. If the greens are all growing at about the same rate, then you can realize, okay, this is okay. But when you have big differences in growth from green to green, that tends to correspond with different green speeds and playability, I think. So that's where I think the clipping volume can be really useful.
Absolutely. So long story short, at Bethpage, there are a couple greens that got rebuilt to USGA specifications probably a decade ago. And we just actually recently last year, Mike Hadley was collecting clipping volume, and those greens grow substantially less than the other greens, which don't grow a lot anyway. It's actually the most consistent clipping volume I've ever seen from a golf course. The range of what they vary, and that's why they're Bethpage Black. But these USGA spec greens were much lower, and that was fascinating to look at. It's a slightly different um, uh, turf surface as well, so it tracks exactly what we were saying. The clipping volume is certainly connected to when we see green speeds that are faster or slower than other greens.
Well, that's really good. Thanks everybody in the chat. If anybody has any more questions, now would be a good time to put them in there. We've had, was it uh, Randy? Randy said hello from Bulgaria. So we've had Randy from Bulgaria, Jason from Canada. Bernardo is now checking in from Portugal, and he he says clipping volume is also very useful, and also the average clipping volume. He's been making these measurements at a couple golf courses where he works in Portugal, and he and I disagree a little bit about infiltration. I had a chance to spend some time with Bernardo in when I was in Catalonia a few weeks ago, and we collected a lot of this data together. And I can't remember how much we talked about infiltration. He makes a note here that it seems also important, and I guess here's what I'm going to say about infiltration: is it's incredibly important because the practical infiltration, the you need to have water being able to go into the surface and get away from the surface, so it needs to infiltrate and then percolate through and drain. I don't know that we actually need to measure it. So for me, if it's a problem, we're going to see it because the surfaces will be consistently too wet. So if you're in a place like Western Canada or Seattle or Portland or Corvallis or Bandon, places on the Pacific Northwest, or if you're in Ireland or Scotland or England, places where in the wintertime you have relatively low evapotranspiration and relatively high precipitation, if you have a problem with infiltration, it will become obvious. To me, I don't really see where it's necessary to put a number to infiltration. That's also something I've managed to go my entire career without paying attention to and without measuring. And that's the kind of thing that it might turn out that 5 years from now, I say, you know what? I, I sure wish I didn't go on the record saying how I didn't think infiltration was important because I now find it an essential tool that should be measured every Friday. So, you know, I reserve the right to change my mind. But up to now, I'm not so keen on infiltration numbers. Well, I recognize that it's absolutely essential. If you don't have enough infiltration, you are definitely not going to have good playability.
Yeah.
I don't know. Have
Yeah,
you measured that?
I'm the same way as you, Mike. I haven't really looked at infiltration. Honestly, really haven't even looked at infiltration data much ever. And um, yeah, it seems like it would be a hard thing to measure. And maybe if you're someone who's uh, renovating a root zone, you might say, and trying to improve drainage vertically, that might be something to figure out. Okay, how much did this practice improve my drainage, or my infiltration? That might make sense, but
I think
um,
if we are measuring firmness, if we're assessing the greens as being too soft just right or too firm on a weekly basis, if the greens don't infiltrate enough, at some point we're going to have irrigated the night before, and that water is going to stay close to the surface, and the surfaces should be too soft. Or it's going to have rained and there's going to be a puddle on the green, and we're not going to be able to take a stimp meter measurement because there's standing water on the green. And we will be able to note that of this green was unplayable due to an infiltration problem. I, so I always feel it's going to be very obvious, and you should be able to track that problem. That problem shouldn't sneak up on you. It should be like, man, the greens sure don't dry down like they used to. Or if you're doing the OM246 measurement, you're going to see our OM2 keeps going up, our OM4 keeps going up. It's like we're clearly not doing enough because the research from New Zealand, there's a really good article by Glasgow et al. From New Zealand, and the OM2 is very highly correlated with infiltration rate, and that and that's it's just like this is something where I think we let's just measure the OM2, which is easy, rather than go to the trouble to measure the infiltration rate, which is problematic and challenging.
yeah.
Alan joined us also. He said he came in late, but he's going to rewind and check out the whole video. Well, I hope you find it worth your time, Alan. Thank you. It's fascinating for me to talk to someone like Carl who applies that engineering type of mindset, but it's also somebody who plays golf and enjoys golf for recreation and competitive, and then works in the industry. And it's fascinating for me. So, how often do you play, Carl?
So I play. I've got an interesting. If you're interested in my golf improvement practice, it's very much like your philosophy, Micah. So once I stopped playing professionally, working a lot, my thought was, this is very interesting because it's your thought and turf is, can I get better and do less? Like, what's the least amount I can do to be a decent golfer? And so the last couple of years, I said, I don't like practicing at the range anymore. I don't like practicing putting. Um, I like playing golf. I like to play golf, and if I'm playing in a tournament, I play 18 holes. So what if whenever I go to the golf course, the only thing I do is play 18 holes, and I warm up for 10 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever, and then go out and play 18 holes, and keep all my stats and look at all my ball striking stats, putting, short game, whatever. And what if that's the only thing I do when I go to the golf course? What if I don't hit range balls? I don't practice putt. I don't sit there for an hour chipping. Um, so I play like 2 times a week, maybe sometimes 3 if I get out on Friday. And I keep all my stats. And over the last 3 years, I've gotten a stroke and a half better. And I go to the range maybe 4 or 5 times a year, just when it's like I got to hit some balls just to if I want to do something with my swing. But almost every time I go to a golf course to play, I tee it up, I play 18 holes, and I go home. And that's literally my practice. It's just simulating the tournament to an extent, and that has worked for me. I don't think it works for everybody, but it's. I spend less time at the golf course. I spend more time with my family here, which is good. I've gotten better, which is good. My stats have all gotten better, which is very interesting. And I practice less, and I don't really like practicing anymore. I'd rather be playing the shots and playing the golf course. So that's what I do. I play on the weekend, usually Saturday, Sunday, maybe one time else during the week, and that's my that's my practice, so to speak.
That's that's very good. Is your main course the Robert Trent Jones course at Cornell University? Is that where you play a lot of rounds?
Yep, yeah, that's basically all my home golf, and then every once in a while I'll go to another golf course
What's that
and
one down
play
by the lake? Newman
Newman
Park?
Municipal. Yes,
But yeah,
yeah.
that I had a couple really fun rounds down there. I always felt like if I got it going down there, I could birdie every hole, which I never did, never close to it. But it was just the kind of course that I'm like, I like this course. It's fun.
It's so I grew up in Ithaca and played Cornell and Newman as a kid, and Newman was very much the 9 hole. You had skins games, and there's all different kinds of people who come down there, and you get older. The older guys would push me around, tell me I'm doing stuff wrong, and you can't stand in my line here. You got to wait until I tee off, and so that you can tee off afterwards. And Cornell was kind of a larger golf course, 18 holes, and but I've learned to appreciate it. Basically anytime I go to a golf course, I find the good things I like about it. And as a player, I'm always like, ooh, like even if it's just the most bare bones, straight up and back, a bunch of holes that are maintained very minimally, I'll always find something that I like, because the experience of playing golf to me is what I enjoy. And just being out there and being like, oh, even though this green was a circle, oh, it was there was this weird little putt that I didn't read right. Ooh, I like that. So that's the kind of stuff I try and whether I'm playing at Cornell or another golf course, I try and focus in on and enjoy.
What do you think the median green speed is in on golf courses in New York? If we take everywhere from the place that's even more basic than uh, Newman Municipal and
Let me,
go.
I'm gonna do, let me just add, I've got it up here.
Oh, you have the
I've got
number,
I've got my state park data, which is a wide range of golf courses. Um, it looks like about 8 to 8.5.
and that includes Bethpage.
That includes the black course as one. Yep, and then this would be 14 other golf courses.
And that's the median, not the mean. Is that
That's the mean. So let me. I don't know what the median would be. The median is probably, I would say, more like 8 to 7 and high sevens.
so half? So that's saying on any given day during the golfing season, if we would go to one of the state park courses, half of them would be above, half would be below.
Something like that. Let me get the median. Median is. Oh, I didn't like that.
Live
Median
coding. It that's impressive.
eight and a quarter.
8.25.
And a
And
quarter.
that's not is that like monthly measurements or something
This
like
so
that?
this was one point. This was taken throughout June in 2018. So
Okay.
that would be prime kind of golfing weather. These weren't on weekends, so that's like a weekday. Me trying to get around at a good time of day. They mowed the greens in the morning.
So
Um,
half the courses had a green speed less than 8 feet 3 inches.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
awesome. Thank you. That's the type of number that I expect is reality.
yeah.
Although if when I talk with some other people, they start saying that the median within their region is like 12 or something. And I'm like, on a daily basis, do you know what? So what you're saying is you half the courses are averaging above that on a daily basis. It just seems improbable to me. But you hear crazy green speed numbers thrown around, and and
It,
so I'm asking you again as a kind of getting back to your competitive golf that you play, and what green speeds are do you like putting on? What green speeds are in tournaments, and what is the reality versus the perception on the golf course maintenance side? Because I think a lot of people, I don't know, I'm interested to hear your comments on this.
yeah, I think whenever I hear a conversation about like, oh, the course around me are at 12, I think it's not a representative sample of all the golf courses. It's probably just the private clubs in that area that have the competition, like the person down the road complex. Oh, the person down the road is 12. I got to be 12 and a half. But there's just so many, at least in central New York, there's so many golf courses that are just daily fee. I like to call them mom and pop, not derogatory, but just as single owners, just operating a golf course. People who are owner, superintendent, running the restaurant, even. There's so many of those golf courses that when you look at the average, it's definitely something more near the 8 range. For tournaments, certainly courses that host kind of competitive events are going to be skewed higher, but very rarely will we play a tournament and I don't measure the stimp meter readings when I when I play a tournament, obviously, but it doesn't feel like we ever get over 10 or 10 and a half, maybe at the highest ones. But that feels like a very good, fair test of green speed. You'll hear my dog crying in the background.
Yeah, how's your time? I think we can kind of wind it down.
Yeah, I think so. It's to finish that conversation. I think as a player, it doesn't matter what you're competing on. There are players who will complain if the greens are slower. By and large, I think someone like me has a mindset of if you're playing a competitive tournament, it's the same for everybody, and therefore it doesn't matter what the conditions are. It's
Mhm.
the lowest score still wins, and it is shocking to me how many people will get to a golf course where the greens are maybe not perfect or maybe they're a little slow, and on the putting green they're warming up to, oh my god, I can't get it to the hole, and I'm kind of thinking, I'm like, you've got half an hour until your tee time. You can learn how to hit it a little harder. Like this isn't a greens problem. This is a you problem.
Yeah, I was.
But that's just a mindset I have, and I know everybody doesn't have that mindset, but
I
I'm
was.
perfectly fine competing on a 7-foot green because it's the same for same for everybody.
Yeah, I had a couple of great conversations with a pro in Spain who's retired now, but he's won some tournaments around the world, and he we were talking about weather and playing in Scotland, and I mentioned it's well, what do you think about playing in that kind of weather? Because sometimes the weather can be pretty harsh. And he's like, oh, I love it because, I've already beaten so many, even at the professional level. He's saying a lot of people would just get there and they're like, oh, I can't play in this. It's too windy, it's too rainy. And he would feel like, of course, it's challenging, but mentally, he just keeps telling himself what a great player he is in those conditions, and he feels like that gives him an advantage. And so, what you're saying about just play the course as you find it and adjust your game, you should be skilled enough to do that.
Yeah, and the thing is, and I talked to tournament organizers for our state organization, and uh, the best player shoots the low score every week. It's not a lot of people think they're the best player, and that through some extraordinarily unlucky uh, uh, string of events that they got all these bad breaks that made them score 10 shots higher than the person who won, you weren't the best player that week. The best player was the one who shoots the lowest score, and that's always how it works. Sometimes, and it's a different test at every golf course. But the bottom line is, whoever the best player is that week shoots the lowest score, and it's not about you got a bad break here and oh, I lost by 7. Like, no, you just weren't as good as that other person, and like, that just happens. So it's a mentality
Yeah,
thing.
it's the green speed issue also. Another thing that I noticed, you mentioned that the type of tournaments that you play, they're 10, maybe 11, but nothing like crazy. And I've been to enough tournaments around the world at the professional level and see the greens at like 11, 11 and a half, maybe 12, a little bit over 12. And then that's typical. And then I hear some people say, "Oh, we have to slow them down for the tournament. We have it faster than this for our members on a daily basis." And it's like, okay, of course you could, but I don't understand why anybody would want to play on greens that are like that. It's I if if you can have a major championship on greens that are rolling 12, or if you can have a major championship on greens that are rolling in at 11 and a half, why can't you play golf on Thursday afternoon on greens that are rolling 11? And
Yeah.
why does it have to be faster? I don't know. I'm not I'm glad I'm not a superintendent at some club where the green committee is insisting on more than that, because I wouldn't want to do it. And I know people get put in that situation where they have to, but I've also measured around the world a lot of places where they're charging a green fee of almost $300, and the tee time is, and it's fully booked, and people are playing on greens 8 feet, 9 feet, and they're so happy to pay their money, so so happy to be out there and enjoy the round and not complaining about the green speed. And I just think it's a pity all the work that has to get done in order to have some green speeds, when what you're talking about, what's average across a big set of golf courses, what I've measured is what's average across a big set of golf courses. What we've both seen is what the green speed is at major championships or professional level or high level amateur tournaments, and then seeing what some people are forced to produce on a daily basis. I I
It doesn't align, right? It doesn't align, and we talk about this with our state park golf courses. Is there's courses where if it's a 9.5 foot green speed, the 80% of the surface is unpinnable, and furthermore, the types of golfers that would play that golf course simply couldn't handle green speeds that were 9.5, because it'll be a ping pong. It's like they're playing tennis back and forth across the golf course or across the green. So there just are courses that through the design, through the types of players there, should not have green speeds above 9 or above 10. And there are other courses that are, if the expectations are there and the architecture allows it, you can do 12 feet. But certainly there's an idea that faster is better. And I would say sometimes slower is better. You get to have pin locations that are more interesting, that are on more slope. That requires more strategy coming in. It still allows it to be playable for the less skilled golfers, and it allows the better golfers maybe to think a little bit more, to experience more break. Those are harder putts. It's kind of interesting to read. Faster is not always better, and I agree. Like, I don't know how superintendents deal with greens committees members that go out there at 7 at night and play and say the greens are slow. Well, they had 16 hours to grow during the day. What does that do to green speed? And so many variables that make it very difficult to operate in that environment.
Yeah, it's that's that's one where, I mean, you mentioned green speed being measured to the inch. I prefer to measure it in centimeters, which takes it already down to an increment less than a half inch, as the base unit of measurement, and then it makes it easy to apply the Breedy correction, because we don't have to deal with that weird inches,
Yeah.
unless you're using a tape that has inches on a decimal scale, which I know they have those kind of tapes. But if you're measuring actual inches, it's a bit tricky to apply that conversion. So I like to use centimeters, and I work it back to feet. And I always do that. So I'm measuring like, okay, it's 333 in that direction. It's 367 in the other direction. And people always come up to me and they say, what's the speed? And I'm like, I don't really care
Oh
what the
yeah,
speed is. I'm doing a research project. I'm going to go calculate this later.
that's
But then I realized, I should make a little app on my phone so that I can just put it in and quickly spit out the number, because so many people ask me, they want to know what the feet and inches are.
it's always fascinating being on a golf course when golfers are there, and I've learned to, and I will never tell anybody a green speed when they come up to me. I'll be like, "What are they rolling at?" And I'll say, "Well, let me see a putt first." And if the putt is short, I'll say, "Well, not fast enough, I guess." And if the putt is long, I'll say, "Well, they're too fast, it looks like." And if it goes in, I'll say, "Oh, rolling just fine." And that's my
Yeah.
way to diffuse the situation.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've found over the past decade or so, I've gotten more and more into measuring playability. And I've been focused much more on assessing the playing conditions of the surfaces, especially putting greens, and less so about. I've been less concerned about potassium deficiencies and surface area removal and the amount of sand I was able to get down and so on. Because in the end, it doesn't really matter what our potassium is. It doesn't really matter how much surface area removal we had. It doesn't matter how much sand top dressing we were able to put down. What matters in the end is what type of playing experience the golfers had. And I think trying to optimize that, maximize the number of days in the year in which the golfers can have a good experience, whether that is at a facility that's being run for profit or a facility that is trying to provide an exclusive member experience. I think the same outcome should be uh, it should be the same desired outcome, to maximize the number of days in the year at which the playability was at an acceptable level for that facility. And that and then everything else ties into that. So yeah, if you have potassium deficiency, you're not going to achieve that. If you did not put enough sand, you're not going to achieve that. But if you put too much sand, you're not going to maximize the number of days either. So the idea is to make sure that you're doing enough. Try not to do too much that's disruptive, but you absolutely have to do anything that's essential. And I've been trying to look at the maintenance work in that framework, which is why I think it makes sense now to at least track things weekly.
I agree, and that's the really impactful stuff that Chris Tritabaugh has done with that data is like the days that he achieved what they determined their benchmark was for the
Yeah.
club.
I'll bring
That is
that I'll bring that chart up real quick. So anybody that's still watching this, I can, under the playability tab, um, this uh Chris, I can navigate to Chris's blog and look at his data. Are you seeing this?
yep, yep.
Let me see. Yeah, I'll just bring up this chart real quick.
And it's so impactful because it's a superintendent, right? It's in the field, and as much as our research stuff is cool to kind of find foundational principles and build on other research, like when you see it like this in the field, it I think it means more, especially as superintendents, when you're trying to apply these concepts, like, oh, there's a person doing this, and oh wow, this makes me think about how many days do I give to my membership or my players that are uh, what they should be getting essentially.
Yeah, it's now Chris is measuring daily. He's measuring daily, not weekly, but he has a big crew and he has the luxury of being able to do that. And you would get the same thing if you measure it a few times a week or at least once a week. But this is just with a bit more detail, and it's an incredible amount of detail because it shows these three lines on this chart are showing three disruptive events that happen, and then how the bobble test goes up above 8 after each of them, but it dropped below 8 with heavy sand top dressing, and an aerification event. And then you can count the number of days that are above a threshold. You can also count the number of days that it took to recover from that disruption. And when you look at it like that, you mentioned earlier saying maybe reflect on it or react to it a bit slowly. You said something like that, Carl, where you can look at this in the future, you look back on it, look at what happened, and then you can say, how could we do that again next time and do it even better to to recover from that disruption more rapidly, or to have fewer days with the disruption.
Absolutely. And whether it's timing, whether it's the follow-up practices to get the sand in the canopy better or whatever, maybe you verticut it before to open it up. Like those are the sorts of things that then you can tool around and say, okay, next time I'm going to measure. And oh, did it happen in 4 days instead of 7 days until I got back to my standards? That's the really cool thing I think that can come out of just taking this real simple data that gets that course back to the standards of your clientele quicker and gives them more days. That makes the course more fun to play.
Yeah, it's something that's been transformative for me in the way that I now think about what type of advice I should be giving, and the type of day-to-day maintenance activities that I recommend. Because I used to be much more textbook oriented, seminar, like what I'd learned in seminars, what I was teaching in seminars, what I was learning from textbooks like those behind me, or what I'd learned from green section record articles and stuff about here's what we should be doing. So then I was going around the world telling people here's what you should be doing in terms of sand and coring and all of this. And there were really good superintendents who were not doing that, who were just doing what I'm recommending now, of just producing good playing surfaces all the time. And they were telling me, but I wasn't listening. They were saying, well, we couldn't possibly disrupt our surfaces that much. It's not realistic. Like, do the math on what you're actually recommending. And I was just like, well, you need to do it anyway. Like, just find a way. Like, and then and then year after year we're having that same conversation, and I keep saying the surfaces are good and they're good and they're good. And it's like, well, maybe all this stuff that I'm saying is necessary is not so necessary after all. And then I started paying attention to playability more, and then that gets me now at definitely in the middle of my career. I'm not so young anymore, so I it's like, man, I wish I knew all this stuff 20 years ago. I, but I know it now, and it's exciting. It's exciting to be able to study this kind of stuff and to say, let's go beyond the textbook. And I think I've got a couple seminars. It's cool. I've been invited to speak at some really interesting conferences around the world this year, and I think in one of them I said, let's call the topic beyond the textbook or something, and just start talking about the kind of things that you need those textbook fundamentals to make sure that you can have 100% grass cover, and make sure that you can keep 100% grass cover, and that you're aware of the things that might be coming up down the road that might prevent you from having 100% grass cover. You definitely need that. But there's a whole layer to it that you either learn on the job, or and
Yeah.
but I don't think what gets learned on the job maybe doesn't get shared through the industry in a really systematic way. But I see the type of things that I can share that I learn from other people and then re-communicate, and maybe I think the idea is mine, but I'm sure I've learned it from other people. Well, it's like clipping volume is something that a lot of other people did. I never thought it was useful until I did, and then I promote it. And then by now it's like yeah, I kind of came up with clipping volume, but I didn't. I didn't. Everybody's been paying attention to that forever, and it's just like, I think Dave Wilbur had a podcast with Kevin Ross, and they said something like, "Yeah, well, I was doing that 30 years ago." And I mean, of course, every good greenkeeper has been doing that. It's just this is a way where we can put a catchy hashtag on it, and it's just like MLSN. It's the most simple thing possible. And Max Schlossberg has written some articles and just saying, well, that's just like um, replacement. It's just like whatever it's called, build and replace, or whatever the standard fertilizer terminology is for that. It's just that, but then they put a name on it. It's nothing new. And yeah, that's right. But the guideline numbers that we're recommending that you stay above, that's a little bit different. But the whole thing is what good greenkeepers have been doing all the time. And it's fun to be in a position to be able to communicate that, to be excited about it, to have a chance to talk with people like you who are doing this on halfway around the world and then going out and playing on it and evaluating it. And then we can just try to do it better next week, next month, and next year.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a blast, Mike. I love this is such a great kind of forum to just like talk about all this stuff, and hopefully, the people watching and on the recording or live here are getting some interesting things out of this. But I think you're exactly right. It's especially all the stuff I'm talking about. It's these other superintendents on New York State Park golf courses who are doing the things, and then I just talk about it to other people because they got other stuff to do. They're not going to sit on a they can't get out twice a week and do the Cornell Turf Show, fastest 30 minutes in turf, to talk about what they're doing. So that's why Frank and I are there to yell at everybody, as Frank would say, and hopefully pick it
That's
up.
good. Yeah, Frank gets through that stuff pretty fast, and you do too. I sometimes like to talk through things, like with the office hour show. I'm so happy that you've had 2 hours to spend with me, where we can just talk about these things that I think we gave a disclaimer at the start, or a heads up at the start, that it may be a bit of a rambling conversation, because there's so many different ways to measure these things and define what playability is and so on. And it's just, I guess the one thread that sticks through it for me is the overall importance of this, certainly in my thinking now, about how the epitome, or the main target of what we're trying to do, the main objective, is and should be about optimizing the playability. And that's something that I definitely neglected earlier in my career. And it's something that now is a focus for me.
And it's funny because like ag, and we pull a lot of our research from ag. Ag does this because everything comes back to how am I going to make money? Well, yield. Okay. Everything comes back to yield, and everything is dollars per pound or whatever. And we don't, and for years in golf, it's like, well, we don't have yield, so we can't do that. But maybe there's a way we can do that. And actually, Michael Becken, who just received his doctorate from UW Madison, just actually came up with a way to figure out how efficient eco efficiency models, how efficient is a golf course at producing rounds, and uh, he looked at pesticide use. Okay, I use X amount of pesticides. How many rounds did I do? Is that good? I use X amount of fertilizer. How many rounds did I do? Is that good? Water. Okay, I use this amount of water for my region, and I did this many rounds. Is that good? Um, Coming back to that bottom line, so he uses rounds as the sort of outcome. And him and I talked about this at the beginning of his research. For him, it was just going to be so difficult to measure playability across a year that he had to use rounds as the proxy. But for superintendents, the proxy is your playability, and how to measure that is the hard part. I think we talked about it a little bit today. That maybe gives people some clarification. But that's the bottom line: is playability, and everything has to come back to that, or else it would be a backwards way to do it if we didn't have that as our bottom line.
But we go to so many seminars at conferences, and it's all about this new fertilizer has a new slow release technology, and um, and then this new wetting agent has, look at this compared with last year's wetting agent. Doesn't it look better? And it's a lot of things related to growing grass and having healthy grass, which is important. Or look at
Mm,
this new, let's go look at this equipment demo day and look at this new technology to strip the surface off or or slice and inject sand or whatever. And it's all really useful, cool tools that are all related to the growing grass aspect of it. The word that I really don't like, I don't like the word agronomy, because from if you look at the dictionary definition of agronomy and then start trying to say how that's related to creating a playing surface for golf or for any sport, I just, I don't like taking pride in the word agronomy, and I've expressed that before, and it's just a word that kind of makes me think, I don't think what we're doing should be glorified as agronomy, because just because it's a fancy word, if you want to use a fancy word, use agrostology. Like say this is the agrostology department or something. Now we're talking about grass science instead of just
mm.
agriculture,
What
because
about curator? What about the word curator? How do you feel about that?
I have no, that does not have a negative connotation for me. So I'm fine with curator,
Okay.
but I I I don't want to, I don't want people to call me an agronomist, and I don't think that golf course agronomy is really what we're doing, because if we focus so much on the healthy grass aspect of it, like it's inherently not healthy to treat grass the way we do in order to have a playing surface. So rather than like get like trying to, yeah, I just,
Hmm.
anyway.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess I feel the same. No, I the bulk of my work now is on environmental best practices. So, like Frank obviously and I focus on how do we protect water quality? How does a golf course have value beyond the recreational component? So that's kind of where I'm focusing nowadays. But you're exactly right. It's not really an agronomist. You're not trying to grow a crop and produce the yield. You're trying to optimize how people recreate, and that's yeah, that's a different thing entirely than being an agronomist.
Yeah. So I know there's a lot of signs that say agronomy department, and a lot of people are have that job title, and that's fine. But I wish like 30 years from now that it wasn't the word that was so commonly used in the industry, because I think seminars about agronomy and learning about agronomy, that's just the start. That's like the fundamental things that you have to know. You have to know the agronomy, but what we're really doing is a little bit beyond that. Now, if you're a sod farmer or something, I think
Mhm.
that you could say, okay, we're doing agronomy, but otherwise, I'd rather avoid the word. Well, we're this is approaching the longest podcast live stream ever. I don't know that we have too much more to talk about at
Yeah,
this
I
point.
think that's a good stopping point, Micah. I think yeah, it's 2 hours, and I think we covered a lot of stuff, and I think there's a lot of tidbits in there, and I'm sure you'll tweet it out, and I'll pull stuff and timestamp stuff for people and direct them, because there's so much stuff you can chop up in these sorts of videos, and that's what makes it kind of like we call it evergreen content that people can go back and reference.
Yeah, it
And
is. There's some a core group of people around the world. It's not a huge audience for this type of content, but there are. I'm glad that for the niche things that we're interested in, there are people around the world who are also interested in this, so we can create content, and then we can take highlights and share that with perhaps a broader audience. But some people will watch this or listen to it and have joined us for much of the live stream, or maybe a few people joined us for all of the live stream to hear this conversation. And I think it's awesome. And I think that we're gonna. I would like to request in the future that we could do this again, because I'm sure that as you do your research projects, I do my research projects, this playability issue is going to keep coming up.
absolutely, absolutely.
All right, Carl. Well, thanks so much for joining me. Thanks to everybody who joined in the live stream: Bernardo, Alan, Randy, Jason. I think those are the people that were chatting with us. And that's all very good comments. Thanks to everybody who listened and watched. And I'll catch you next time on the next office hours. Thanks, everyone. Bye bye.